Start. Hello, dear guests. In this room, we are going to overview the topics related to data security breaches. So, as it was discussed already in the conference, that alongside with the technological progress, the number of cyber security threats increase. So we have wise and highly professional lectures to give us insight. So I'm pleased to invite the first speaker, Mr. Chester Wisniewski.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me here. This is a good, intimate little session. So if you have questions or you want to debate me, ask me a question, share a story, feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me and we can talk, because a small group like this, it's nice to be able to interact if you choose that you have something you'd like some clarity on. I want to apologize for my slides being slightly cut off because I work day to day on a Linux laptop, so I don't have Windows and I don't have Office, so I don't have PowerPoint. So I use LibreOffice, an open source Linux tool, and when I converted it to PDF, it got a little bit bigger than it should be to fit exactly on the screen. There won't be anything missing, but that's why it's cut off. It's not the conference's fault, it's my fault. I want to make that clear. So if you weren't in the main session, I'll just briefly explain what I do at Sophos. I do the kind of big picture security research for the company. So rather than being an analyst looking at specific malware samples all day, like many people do in our labs, I kind of sit alongside of them, learn from what they're learning, and try to put together the bigger picture of what's happening in this sort of larger threat landscape. And so I'm going to talk about some things that I think we can do around the basics, maybe get a little creative with some of the tried and true tools we already have and get better use out of things that we've already invested in. I find that when I go and do a customer on-site visit with our salespeople when I'm traveling sometimes, they've had a breach or they've had a problem even though they're a customer, and they're like, what went wrong? And I'm like, like, you've got all these great tools, but you're not really using them as well as you could. You don't necessarily need to buy another one or a new thing or a fancy box or an upgrade. So those things help. Please talk to us. We'll sell you stuff. But the important thing is a lot of the things we already have, we're not getting as much benefit as we could be getting from them. And so I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so highlighting the things that I think we can think more creatively about how we're managing risk and how we're using those tools to get more, I guess as the Americans say, bang for your buck. If you've already invested in these things, how can you get more out of your investment than you had before? Is the wrong button, or button is not working? There, that button. All right. So this is a quote from Voltaire. The perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think we get really caught up in this as technical folks, especially the people that are doing the day-to-day work, that are responsible for using the tools and managing our endpoints and our servers and responsible for our data protection. And we think everything should be applied evenly. We're going to do the same computer-based training for all staff on how phishing is dangerous. We're going to make sure every computer is patched, all that kind of thing. Oh, that's like a little mouse. Sorry, I'm not used to this pointer. And we get too obsessed with that stuff, so we got to look at these things more practically. And if you were in the opening sessions this morning in the main room, there was a gentleman speaking about SCADA threats and talking about how patching a system had taken down a nuclear power plant. And that's kind of an unexpected outcome for most of us, right? We think, well, we got, obviously it's dangerous having an unpatched computer in such a sensitive environment, but obviously there's a lot of unknowns when you're doing these things. And I think you have to start by not having that one uniform policy again. I see most organizations, they want to have one policy for everything to make it easy. And the problem with that is it doesn't really take into account the risk categories that you really have. I mean, within Sophos internally, we kind of categorize everything as desktop, server, and enterprise apps. And while those enterprise apps may run on servers, they're really two still separate categories in a way. There's the platform that supports that app, the Windows operating system or Red Hat Linux or whatever it may be. And then there's the thing that's running on top of it that's the critical business application. How you go about patching those and how you determine the risk is completely different for each of those three things and how you're going to go about testing them. But I don't think that just because you have a change control twice a year for your SAP systems means you should only fix Windows twice a year that SAP is running on, right? You really need to try to separate those things and think about them that way from a risk standpoint. Almost every business, including ours, we have a lot of XP at Sophos because we have to still test it. We have customers using our software on XP, so obviously we have to have XP to test whether it still works correctly for those customers that are paying for extended support. But even aside from that, we have critical business apps that are old that still require XP. And it's 3.5% of the reporting computers in our data set. So of our customer base, 3.5% of the PCs are still running Windows XP. It's pretty surprising because Windows 7 is going to be discontinued 89 days from today. It was 90 days yesterday. So you got 3 months to get rid of Windows 7 from an official support standpoint, right? But we still have 3.5% of Windows XP. And many of those things aren't going to go away. So you have to think about, we're seeing the thing that we're doing, that we're seeing the most positive impact from with XP to help manage that risk is only running the critical app that that needs XP and putting it in a virtual machine and making sure that's on a network that requires a VPN to access it. So just kind of isolating it in a VM on a VM server and then VPNing into that network to provide that extra layer of security. Now that may not be possible in all environments. Each environment, of course, can be different. We have a customer in Vancouver where I live that's a school, and they teach trade students how to operate the big computer-operated drill presses and stuff. It cost 2 million Canadian dollars when they bought it 10 years ago. It runs Windows XP. They have a 30 or 40-year life on that piece of equipment. They don't have enough money to go buy a new one that runs Windows 10 or Windows 7. They're going to have to figure out a way to continue to educate their students with that equipment for a long time after this is discontinued, right? So in that environment, it's like, well, it's not a production piece of equipment that makes money for them. So maybe they don't need the VPN. Maybe we'll just virtualize the Windows XP to put a layer around it to give it a little bit of protective insulation. But if it goes down and they need to rebuild it, it's not something that's losing them money like might put a company out of business if they rely on a piece of industrial equipment. So that's, kind of some things I think we need to think about. We also forget about supply chain and how complex our supply chains are for all the software coming into our environments. And that's something that, again, is a case-by-case thing. But you have to remember that when you buy those HP laptops and they have that auto-updating software, that stuff is constantly being compromised. And now I'm not picking on HP here. Pick a brand. Lenovo, HP, Asus. They all have constant vulnerabilities in the extras and utilities and things they load on these things. So having that corporate policy of sort of that standard Windows image that many big enterprises have, we're recommending that come down to even smaller businesses, even if they're buying their computers at a local shop. Have that standard image and get rid of all that extra software, just like you don't want all those extra apps on your Android phone. If you have an Android, you often buy certain brands, they come with a bunch of stuff preloaded. Getting rid of that preloaded software reduces the risk dramatically. You need to get that thing off the computer if at all possible. And some of us forget that IoT is more than light bulbs and dolls that talk and all these kinds of things, right? Odds are if you're in a modern building, your lifts are connected to your network and they're being remotely monitored by the elevator maintenance company. Your Coca-Cola machine is probably on the network to tell Coca-Cola it's out of Coke and they should come put more in it. There's lots of enterprise IoT, I call it. They're the things that are not industrial. They're not control systems. They're not chemical plants. They're not power processing. They're everyday things that are in our businesses that control the heating, the cooling, the lights, the lifts, the security system, the cameras. All that stuff is IoT, and putting it on your general purpose business network introduces a lot of risk because those devices often are not very secure. So it's worth having a separate Wi-Fi or VLAN in your corporate network just for IoT devices to put those things, as opposed to just giving them access to the normal corporate LAN that you would put your laptops, smartphones, and PCs on to reduce that risk. Like at home, I run a separate SSID that's like my name -IoT that I put my IoT toys that I play with on to keep them away from my sensitive data. And I don't see very many businesses doing that, but businesses need to start thinking about that because especially Well, maybe 5G is going to change that a little bit, because with 5G, these devices may not be on your LAN anymore. They may directly talk through the phone network to the manufacturers. But at least at this point, mostly they go on our Wi-Fi and on our LANs, and we have to remember to assess the risk of those. I already talked about this a little bit. I mean, often you can't patch, or it's not sensible to patch. And I think the first thing is segmentation and isolation is the easiest and cheapest thing to do. I mean, everybody has a firewall. It's easy to create a network segment to try to protect those devices from all the other devices, or more often, protect the other devices from the ones that are vulnerable, because they're the ones that are most likely to become compromised, and you don't want them attacking other computers. WannaCry is just a perfect example of how that went wrong for so many companies not having any isolation. And the problem with something like WannaCry is it only took the one unpatched computer to get the initial infection, to then start password guessing and all kinds of other behaviors that it had to spread around networks. So back to I think it was, I want to say it was Maersk, and I forget which one in particular, but one of the big shipping companies that was hit literally had figured out that in the end it was like 5 computers that they couldn't patch that initially got the WannaCry infection. And then they attacked the rest of the network until they got into other systems. So keeping them segmented is important. Exploit mitigation, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, we have our product Sophos Intercept X, but there's a lot of things out there. Some people call it virtual patching. If you can't put real patches on the Oracle system and it has to face the internet, then you should have something in place to detect exploitation on that box, so that at least you can kill a process when it's known to be actively being exploited. And those tools work remarkably well. I mean, there's only, technically the definition of an exploit is getting a computer program to run code it shouldn't run. Get it to run your code rather than the code that it's designed to run. And there's only about 30 different methods to convince a program to run code it's not supposed to run. And they're quite easy. They're not easy. It's hard code to write, but I mean, we can monitor for the behaviors that indicate that thing has happened. So if you take an example of something like buffer overflow attacks, is one way that you can, put more data in the buffer than is supposed to, which means you can overwrite part of the program, and then when you overwrite the program, it runs your program instead of the real program. Well, that's quite easy for modern security software to detect, right? We know that you're only supposed to put 32 bytes in this entry, and you put 64 bytes in. We'll just stop that, right? Now, it's inconvenient because you crash the program when you stop it. But would you rather crash the program, or would you rather have the program install malware and ransom all your servers? I mean, it's pretty obvious to me I'd rather crash the application than have that occur. So exploit mitigation tools are a really big help. Obviously, that's why we have defense in depth. And I think, we're not, take advantage of all this containerization and virtualization. This is another thing that we've been using a lot more internally as well to allow us to take more risk, which is, we've got everything virtualized now, and more of our enterprise software is being deployed in Docker containers and things like that in the cloud. And because of that, we can actually apply those fixes for a small percentage of users immediately and see if they break anything. And it's so easy to roll it back, right? You kind of snapshot like you would a snapshot a virtual machine. You just roll back to a previous container, and so you can very easily test things, prototype things. I think, even legacy systems, by putting them in a VMware, vSphere environment or whatever brand of virtualization your company may subscribe to, gives you that flexibility to do more of that testing, and be a little more aggressive with deploying things more quickly. And lastly, we need to start putting this contractually. If you're a big company, if you work for a large organization, especially in industrial side of things, hospitals, factories, these types of organizations, government, it's kind of unacceptable to me that I bought a $2 million machine to teach kids the trades, and that after only owning it for 5 years, I don't get fixes, even though they know I'm going to use it for 30 years. And this is what we see in the medical industry so often as well. Medical equipment that's running 10, 15-year-old operating systems that aren't fixed. But of course, you don't buy a new MRI machine every 5 years to get new software. It's too expensive. So we need to start putting this in our contracts to say, if you're selling me a device that has a 20-year lifetime, how are you going to provide me software that's secure for 20 years? Because otherwise I'm not buying it from you. I'll buy it from your competitor. That's a differentiator. It needs to be in our requests for quotation or requests for information when we're approaching buying new projects. I think firewalls are cool again. People think that firewalls aren't very useful because if you were in my session this morning, I talked about in a post-Snowden world, we're at like this 90% of things are encrypted now, which makes it more difficult to analyze what kind of traffic is traversing your network in many cases. But I see all kinds of opportunities to take advantage of it, and I think it's incredibly important for people here because of things like GDPR regulation, where you need to be able to attest to whether data has been taken from your environment, if that data impacts people's privacy. And to me, firewalls are like border checkpoints. I was in Berlin a couple days ago and walked by Checkpoint Charlie, and kind of maybe every time I walk past there, I think, in my strange head, I go into nerd world and I see a firewall. It's a spot where we're checking things to see if they should be coming and going, and even if we allow them through, we log that something went out or something came in, and that allows us to do forensics if we have an incident later. And I think this is another thing. It's not, firewalls aren't just there. In fact, most of the time firewalls aren't blocking almost anything anymore, because most of us don't know what traffic is on our network. We kind of let everything go, and that's okay, but keeping track of what came and went is super important, so you can roll back later and figure out what happened if something goes wrong. And because we're not putting those barriers in our networks, so like at Sophos we have, the finance department is firewalled separately from the engineering department, and that's firewalled separately, of course, from the labs. And those rules inside the network, most of them are open. It's not that we block anything from financing to engineering or engineering to finance, but if we have an incident, we want to, one, be able to isolate one part of the company from the rest so we don't have a contagion across the whole business. It also allows us to see, somebody's been stealing information, malicious insiders. You've now got logs of malicious insiders moving things around potentially if you need to be able to investigate something like that. If the firewall isn't there, you've got no visibility into any of it. And obviously it helps you with the compliance and stopping worms and more advanced techniques when you have human attackers like lateral movement. But more than anything, to me, it's all about that visibility, that logging. And it also means I can know what normal is. What is normal? In one of the big credit card attacks in the US, a terabyte of information was being copied out every day that wasn't a month before. And you're going, you'd think you'd notice a terabyte that was never there before suddenly going across the network. But if you're not looking or you're not logging it, you won't know. And that's establishing that baseline is really, really important, and firewalls are very helpful for that. And also, visibility and control. If you are, getting more aggressive with your firewalling tactics, you need to make sure that you're getting some visibility into, applications. Again, the more granularity you have, the more you're going to notice something that isn't right. So if you just know if you know every day you transit 25 gigabytes to the internet, and one day it's 30 gigabytes, you might look into that. But that's not very detailed. So if you're doing SSL or TLS interception, that starts giving you a lot more application visibility. Now I know that a gigabyte of it's Spotify. I mean, maybe I'm upset with that. Maybe I'm happy with it. If listening to music makes my staff happy and they're more productive, fine. Listen to your tunes. I don't care if it's a gigabyte of Spotify. But I need to know what that traffic is in order to make judgments based on whether it's safe for my organization or not. And those firewalls also provide the opportunity to put in those credential checks, multi-factor, to get access to a sensitive part of the network, VPNs that you're going to isolate those Windows XP computers with potentially, and without them, threat intelligence doesn't have any value, right? You need to be able to consume that threat intelligence to actually act on it, and that means having visibility into what's inside of those packets and where they're coming and going. Moving to the cloud. Whether you plan on moving to the cloud or not, your staff might be, even if you tell them they're not allowed. There's many companies I've talked to that the marketing department took out their Visa card and just stood up a web server on Amazon to run a new ad campaign because they thought IT was too slow. They didn't. If I ask for IT to do it, it's going to be 2 months for them to provision a web server. I'll just put it on my credit card and do it myself. And there's advantages to using some of these services, so I'm just going to walk through a few of the common things and both maybe advantages and risks that I see. Software as a service is, I think it's really good. You need to look at each service you're currently running in your IT department and decide whether you think you can do it better than the other provider. And there's two things we recently moved to SaaS at Sophos that we made the decision that the vendor was probably better at it than us. One was Office 365. We had 6 full-time Exchange administrators at Sophos just managing our Windows Exchange servers. And we're going, that's a lot of money and wasted resource, to be honest. Like, those engineers are really talented. They could be doing something much better for us in deploying new technology or enabling our staff to do more. And instead, they're managing email. Like, Microsoft's really good at managing email. I trust, they're externally audited. Like, we're not going to do a better job at securing our Exchange servers than Microsoft is. Why don't we just let Microsoft do it? And now we can redeploy those staff members on projects that actually matter for our business, which our business is to deliver security to our customers, not to run Exchange servers. And the same thing would happen with our CRM. We ended up moving to Salesforce.com a few years ago for the same reasons. I think we had something like 20 developers working on our CRM system. We used to use Pivotal, which is a on-site software package. And we had to do a lot of custom development for Pivotal. So we still have software developers. We have Salesforce.com software developers now who build custom things in their environment for us that we need in order to enable our Salesforce. But the 20 people required to maintain the SQL servers and the hard disks and the backups and the air conditioning and all the other stuff in the server, it was a huge operation running our CRM. And we're like, Salesforce is way better at knowing what threats and what types of attacks are occurring against CRM systems than we are. Like, we're experts in other types of threats and things. So let's take those engineers and get them building software and enabling our people that are building our software to deliver new stuff to our customers. So I think you have to look at each situation and say, could I do it better? And it also helps move you toward a zero trust model, which I think is the right secure approach, giving people access to the content wherever they're at by proving their identity and making sure everything is always encrypted. Then there's infrastructure as a service, and obviously that's just renting virtual machines on somebody else's physical infrastructure, right? It's just somebody else's computer, and the benefits though come back to that testing and patching stuff. So we've been able to massively reduce our patch time on our sensitive applications that face the internet because of moving it into Amazon's cloud. We mostly use. I think we use Azure for some stuff, but we're mostly using Amazon EC2 for Sophos applications internally. And that means we could just take one and copy it, apply the patch, play with it for a few days, and it's an exact copy of what we have in production without the data. And when we're satisfied the patch is fine, we can promote that one to production and let it access the data, and if nobody complains in a week, we can turn off the old one. And it costs us pennies. I mean, it just doesn't cost anything to do it compared to physical hardware and having to manually run around in server rooms and prop things up. So that's a real big benefit, and obviously scalability, but that rollback, roll forward, I think is, you can do it in you can do it in VMware, and you can do it in these other platforms, but it's more involved, and it costs more money. So, both options are available, but I think most organizations we see are moving into the container realm and deciding that this is the fast, cheap way to test those fixes, be more agile, not just with your software development, but being able to be more secure by rolling out more secure profiles and settings and configurations with more confidence that you're not going to break anything and that you can go back to where you were easily enough. Identity is the real challenge, both for technology and for people. Social engineering is increasing dramatically, and part of the problem is we're all using these other tools now to communicate. We don't ever actually talk to each other on the phone. I mean, I know some millennials that don't realize you can talk on a phone. They think it's just for texting. So that has reduced our ability to filter out bad people who are impersonating us, and that's a real challenge. And there's nothing technologically we can do about that problem. We have to go about it by looking at business processes rather than maybe software or firewalls or magic software solutions. I only pretty much communicate with my boss via Microsoft Teams, which happens to be the standard we use inside of Sophos as part of our O365 environment. But I had to get some budget approval to spend some money on some gear for research a few days ago. And I messaged my boss through Teams. I'm like, hey, can I have $25,000? And he's like, maybe, call me. I called him up, and he's like, I just needed to make sure the message was coming from you before I approve, and what's going to happen with it. I need a verification this isn't somebody who's hacked your account and is trying to get me to wire money or move money into another budget that's not supposed to go to, right? And that process, I don't think, can be done technologically. Like, it requires human beings to understand that we have a process to verify identity in certain critical situations and not rely on the mobile phone in our pocket as this exclusive way we're communicating with someone, because these do get stolen and they do get hacked, and all of us have weaknesses at some point in our lives where we can become compromised. So, business email compromise is a huge problem of, tricking people into doing wire transfers. There's almost nothing any of us in these hallways can do to help you. I mean, we're all using machine learning models and things to try to train up on better defending against the initial phishing emails that usually start those attacks, but we'll never be perfect. Some of those messages are going to get through to people. So business process is your last chance at stopping those attacks. So like, we have a process now that says, the finance department can wire money just like they always do, no difference in policy, unless there's an account number change or a new account. And then they have to use both telephone and an electronic method to verify that the change is correct and that it's actually the person who's supposed to authorize it. So far, that's been enough. And the good news is that only happens like 2 or 3 times a month. So that extra procedure isn't a burden on the people in finance. We're not getting in their way so they can't do their jobs or slowing them down. But twice a month, when this weird situation comes up where a company goes, we switched banks, and we need you to wire the money for the trash collection to our new bank, not the old bank, we make sure that there's a secondary verification before that process goes through as a procedure rather than as a technological block or technological means. And I mean, authentication is key here. We have to find ways of enabling better authentication without giving people unreasonable advice. I mean, almost every company I know tells their staff, you should use a long, complex password, and it should be different than all the ones used on the internet. And I can guess that almost 0 of your staff comply with that policy unless you're enabling them. So, when we make these kinds of decisions, we need to enable our staff to have a chance at complying with the things we want them to do. And one way to do that is here's a password manager. We've bought a corporate license for LastPass, 1Pass, or whatever. Doesn't matter. They're all good. Whatever one you trust. But we bought a corporate license for it. Put it on your laptop. Put it on your phone. Use it at home to protect your own bank account and your personal matters. But we want you to get in this habit, and we're going to make you safer and your family safer, and we're going to teach you how to do it, and we're going to give you the tool to enable you to comply with this crazy policy of having these long, complex passwords. Tokens are great if you can afford. These are getting so cheap now. The FIDO tokens that you can get pretty on like Alibaba and Amazon and things are down to somewhere around 5 or 6 euros a piece now. Really cheap. It's inconvenient for people. They don't like to have to plug something in, but for critical applications, you can do that. So I've got a couple minutes left. I'm just going to share one last kind of thing that we're doing around that I think is a good practice. If you've been in threat intelligence sharing for any amount of time, you may know the traffic light protocol. And if you're not familiar with it, I'll just briefly describe the idea being that something is TLP green, it means you can share it pretty openly, right? It's okay to share this information. It's not secret. If it's yellow, maybe you can only share it with people who have a need to know that you trust. And if it's red, you can only share it with people within your organization that have a need to know that you trust. And so that kind of limits. Well, I look at authentication in a business the same way. I do not want to get in the way of I don't want to make it hard to get into Salesforce. I'm looking at our sales guy in the back, Justinas. I don't want it hard for him to sell stuff and get into the CRM database, right? I want him to sell. But on certain critical times, I want to make sure it's really him. So I got to decide with this traffic light protocol maybe when I'm going to ask for more authentication. If something is a reasonably non-critical system, I'll call it green. All right, it's non-critical. You know what? Just a password is enough to log in. You just type your username and password. I don't care if you're on a computer at the library, at the hotel, whatever. It's fine. If it's a middle critical system, maybe I require that you're on a company-owned device and you use your password. And if it's a critical system, you need to be on a company-owned device, use your password and a token. Right? I'm going to send you a Duo message to your phone, or I'm going to make you plug in a YubiKey or something like that to authorize who you are. So that's what successful organizations I see trying to reduce the burden on their staff, so that only once in a while do you have to have that token. Only once in a while do you have to do it from the company laptop. But getting out of the way for most of the non-critical stuff, so people can just do their jobs and be accountants and be tech support people and not have to worry about constantly having to fumble around to authenticate with tokens and things, right? Those of us that are paranoid like me, I mean, I have token authentication on everything, but I wouldn't do that to other people that I care about. So why would I do that to my employees, right? I don't make my wife do that. And if it's not good enough for my family, then I don't think it's good enough for my staff at my company. We should try to always use our expertise to apply the difficult stuff where it's needed. And the rest of the time, try to get out of the way and let people live their lives and do the things they need to do. So that was my thoughts on kind of rethinking a few of the things that we've been doing with our firewalls, with how we log in, all these types of things. I hope you got some idea from it that maybe is something you hadn't thought of before. And if you would like to share any of your experiences or contradict me, I love a good argument. I'll be around all afternoon, and if I make it to the party tonight, I get especially argumentative over a beer or a glass of wine. So thank you very much. Cheers.